The first thing you feel isn't the cold, but the vibration. It travels up from the cobblestones, through the thin soles of your boots, and settles deep in your bones, a ceaseless, grinding hum. It is the sound of Avignon's great mills, a city chewing on the grain of the surrounding farmlands, a sound that promises bread for the fortunate and unending labor for the rest. Here, in the choked alley you call a workshop, the sound is a constant reminder of the world's relentless mechanics, so different from the ones you once knew. Your fingers, long and stained with a mottling of ink, iron oxide, and dried blood, hover over the man's open mouth. The stench hits you like a physical blow, a foul cocktail of rotting meat, sour wine, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The man, a dyer by trade with hands permanently stained a woad blue, whimpers as you probe the offending molar with a slender, wickedly sharp tool. It was once a stylus, used for burnishing gold leaf onto the vellum of holy books. Now, its purpose is far less divine. Escapement, palate fork, balance will, the words are a ghost in your mind, a prayer from another life. A life of clean lines, of order, of the predictable and beautiful logic of a clock's heart, or the perfect geometry of a capital, in a psalter. That was Silas the scribe, a man who believed the universe could be understood, measured, and transcribed. A man who is now dead. In his place is you. The tooth puller. Is it the worm, master? The dyer gurgles, his eyes wide with the superstitious terror of his age. You don't answer. You never do. Answering gives them hope, or worse, invites conversation. You prefer the simple transaction of pain. You shift your grip, bringing the heavier tool into play, a pair of pliers, crude and heavy, forged by a blacksmith who specialized in horseshoes. Bite down on this, you mutter, pushing a small, leather-wrapped block of wood between his teeth on the opposite side. He obeys, his knuckles white where he grips the arms of the stool. You find your purchase on the blackened crown of the tooth. You feel the slight give of the diseased root, the spongy resistance of the swollen gum. The man tenses, his breath hitching. You don't give him a count. Mercy, in this trade, is speed, not ceremony. You twist and pull in one fluid, brutal motion. There is a wet, sickening crack, a sound like a green branch snapping. The dyer screams, a high, thin wail that is swallowed by the alley's oppressive air. His body convulses. You hold firm, planting a boot on the floor and leaning back with your full weight. The root, stubborn and deep, resists for a heart-stopping moment before relinquishing its hold with a final, gruesome tear. You stumble back, the tooth held tight in the plier's grip. It is a foul, jagged thing, its roots tinged black with decay. Blood floods the man's mouth, spilling over his lips and down his chin, a shocking crimson against his blue-stained beard. He slumps forward, sobbing, a series of shuddering, broken gasps. You drop the tooth into a small tin bowl on your workbench. It lands with a dull clink, joining a half-dozen others. You don't look at it. You are already rinsing a rag in a bucket of murky water. You hand it to the man. Press this to the hole. And no wine for a day. He takes the rag with a trembling hand, his eyes glazed with the shock of pain and the dawning relief. He fumbles inside his tunic and produces two small, worn coins, pressing them into your palm. They are warm and slick with sweat. You don't thank him. Gratitude, like hope, is a currency you no longer trade in. After he stumbles out of the alley, leaving behind the lingering stench of his fear, you pick up the tin bowl. The teeth rattle against each other. They are not trophies. They are not grim reminders. They are inventory. Later, as the gas lamps begin to hiss to life in the more prosperous quarters, you make your way through the labyrinthine streets of the lie, the city's festering underbelly. Here, the air is thick with the smells of the tanneries, the reek of the open sewer that runs down the center of the lane, and the sweet, cloying odor of cheap gin. You pull your collar tight, your movements quick and silent. You are a ghost in this part of the city, a necessary evil, and you have learned that notice is a dangerous thing to attract. Your destination is a small, Unmarked door in the shadow of the old bridge. You knock 3 times, a pause, then twice more. The door creaks open a sliver, revealing a single, suspicious eye. Silas, a voice rasps. You're late. The work is when it comes, Finn. The door opens wider, and you slip inside. The room is a magpie's nest of salvaged junk, lit by a single tallow candle. Finn, the city's most prolific river scavenger, sits on a pile of sodden rope, sorting through his day's findings. He is a small, wiry man with the perpetual dampness of the river about him and eyes that have seen everything and judged nothing. What have you got for me? He asks, not looking up from a tarnished silver button he is polishing on his sleeve. You append the tin bowl onto a piece of sackcloth. The teeth scatter. Finn leans in, his practiced eye assessing the quality. He pokes at the dyer's molar with a dirty fingernail. A good one. Solid root. The gentry'll like this one for their new grins, he mutters. He separates the better teeth from the cracked or overly decayed ones, creating 2 small piles. The rich pay for a pretty smile, and the poor pay for the parts. The world's a mouth, Silas, just eating itself. He counts out a few coins, their value far exceeding what the dyer paid you. This is the true nature of your work. You are not merely an extractor of pain. You are a harvester. You take the decay of the poor and sell it as a component for the vanity of the rich. A grotesque, perfect cycle. You pocket the money without a word. Heard about the weaver's girl, Finn says conversationally, his voice low. Eliza. Fever's got her bad. Coming from her jaw, they say. You stiffen. The weaver, Thomas, and his wife, Anya, live a few doors down from your hovel. Anya sometimes leaves a small loaf of bread on your step, an act of charity you've never acknowledged but always accepted. An act that now feels like a debt. It is not my concern, you say, your voice flat. Finn shrugs, a gesture that holds no judgment. Maybe. Maybe not. But the fever's not waiting for it to be. Master Gable has already been sniffing around. You know what that means. You know. Allard Gable, master of the Apothecaries' Guild, a man whose power in these slums was as absolute as the king's was in his castle. A man who saw sickness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for indenture. You leave Finn's den and step back into the night. The mill's vibration feels different now, more sinister. The city isn't just chewing grain. It is chewing on people, grinding them down, and men like Gable are there to collect the dust. You walk towards your room, the weight of Finn's coins heavy in your pocket, the name of a sick child echoing in the hollow space where your own hope used to be. Current part characters, 7989. Total characters, 7989. Kant. The room is a cell. For damp stone walls, a floor of packed earth, and a single, high window shuttered against the night. Your cot is a pile of straw in the corner. Your workbench is the room's altar. Upon it, laid out with a precision that borders on reverence, are your tools. Not the crude pliers and levers for the daily work, but the others. The ones you keep wrapped in oilcloth. You unroll the cloth. The steel gleams in the candlelight, probes, files, and tweezers of a breathtaking delicacy. They are the last remnants of Silas the scribe. You pick up a tool with a fine, curved point, designed for scraping away excess wax in the illumination of a manuscript. You remember the feel of vellum under your hand, the scent of ink and melting beeswax, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly formed letter. A clean world. An orderly world. You place the tool back down. Its purpose now is to scrape pus from a bone. The thought of the weaver's daughter, Eliza, is an unwelcome stone in your shoe. You try to push it away. Pity is a luxury, a weakness that this city exploits without mercy. To care is to invite pain, not just for yourself, but for the object of your care. And yet, the memory of Anya's small kindnesses, of bread left without expectation of thanks, persists. The next morning, the proof of Finn's words arrives. As you are cleaning your pliers, a shadow falls over your doorway. You don't need to look up to know who it is. The very air seems to thin, the ambient squalor of the alley seeming to draw back from the presence of inviolate cleanliness. The tooth puller, a quiet voice says. It is not a question. You look up. Master Allard Gable is even more immaculate than rumor suggests. His dark wool tunic is perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a high sheen despite the muddy lane. His hands, resting atop a silver-handled cane, are soft and pale. He is an island of pristine order in an ocean of filth. Master Gable, you acknowledge, your tone level. I am told you are a man of some skill, Gable continues, his eyes scanning your meager setup with an unreadable expression. Crude, perhaps, but effective. The work is crude. The results are what matter. Indeed. Gable takes a step closer. His gaze falling upon the tin bowl, which holds a single, newly pulled incisor from a morning customer. I am here about the weaver, Thomas. A valued member of our community. He and his family are under the guild's protection. His daughter, I hear, is unwell. Fevers come and go. This one, I think, will not simply go, Gable says, his voice silky. It requires management. The guild provides such management. For a price, of course. A price Thomas cannot pay. His debt will be settled through service. A sensible, orderly solution. He is telling you that the family belongs to him. That Eliza's sickness is the key that will lock them into the guild's workhouse. What has this to do with me, you ask, your hand tightening on the pliers. Only this, Gable says, his polite smile never wavering. You are a puller of teeth. A useful, if messy, function. Do not mistake yourself for a healer. A healer creates hope. And hope, in a place like this, is a disruption to the natural order of things. It makes people unreliable. Confine yourself to your trade. There is no profit for you in the affairs of the weaver's family. Only risk. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The threat hangs in the air between you, as sharp and cold as a winter morning. He is drawing a line. After he leaves, the alley feels dirtier than before. His cleanliness has only served to highlight the surrounding decay. You look at your hands, at the tools of your trade. Confine yourself to your trade, the words are a cage. For years, you have done just that, building a wall of detachment between yourself and the suffering you process. Now, a man in a clean suit has pointed out that your wall is not for your protection, but for his convenience. That evening, you find yourself outside the weaver's tenement. A low, pained moaning seeps from under the door. You hesitate for a long moment, the coins from Finn heavy in your pocket. This is not your fight. To interfere is madness. It is to challenge a man who holds the entire slum in his manicured hand. But then you hear another sound, Anya, the weaver's wife, her voice a low, desperate whisper as she tries to soothe her child. You think of the bread. You think of the neat, orderly script you once practiced. You think of the world of logic and reason that was stolen from you. And you knock. The door opens to reveal Thomas, his face a mask of sleepless despair. Anya is behind him, cradling Eliza in her arms. The child is pale, her face swollen grotesquely on one side, her breathing shallow. The air in the room is thick with the sweet, foul smell of advanced infection. Silas? Thomas asks, his voice hoarse with surprise. You look past him, at the sick child, at the terror in her mother's eyes. You see the cage Gable was talking about, its bars closing around this family. And in that moment, the careful, bitter resignation you have cultivated for years cracks. I can help, you hear yourself say. The words feel alien in your own mouth. But it will cost everything you have. And possibly, everything I have as well. The decision is made. Not with logic, not with hope, but with a sudden, reckless defiance. You have stepped over the line Gable had drawn. The only question now was what you would find on the other side. To save Eliza, you need more than skill. You need resources. The infection in her jaw is deep, a pocket of pus pressing against the bone. A simple extraction is useless, it would be like removing a single rotten apple from a barrel already consumed by mold. The abscess must be lanced, drained, and cleaned. And for the child to survive such a procedure, you need something to manage the pain, something to grant her the mercy of unconsciousness. You need a tincture of mandrake root, a powerful and dangerous sedative. A substance controlled exclusively by the Apothecaries Guild. A substance controlled by Allard Gable. Your America Fund, the secret hoard of coins beneath your floorboard, is your only asset. It represents years of swallowed pride, of enduring the stench and the screams. You take the small, heavy pouch and venture back into the city's treacherous veins. Your first stop is not the guild hall. To approach Gable directly would be to admit defeat. You need the black market. You need Finn. You find him by the river, using a long hook to sift through the sludge exposed by the low tide. He works with a placid focus, oblivious to the filth that cakes his arms to the elbow. Mandrake, you say, without preamble. Finn looks up, wiping his nose with the back of a muddy hand. He squints at you. That's guild business, Silas. That's Gable's business. I told you. I'll pay, you say, showing him the pouch. He lets out a low whistle, his eyes widening at the weight of it. That's a king's ransom for a tosher. Or a fool's price for a death sentence. What's in it for you? The girl. That is my affair. Finn studies your face for a long moment, his gaze sharp. You've got the look of a man about to kick over a wasp's nest just to see if they'll fly. All right. But it won't be the pure stuff. Gable keeps that under lock and key. I know a man, an apothecary's assistant with sticky fingers and debts. He waters it down, but it's the best you'll get outside the guild. It will cost you nearly all of this. He gestures to the pouch. The transaction is made in the back of a gin palace, a quick, furtive exchange. You are left with a small, dark vial and a handful of remaining coins. The liquid inside is thick and smells of damp earth and something vaguely sweet. You pray it will be enough. But Gable's eyes are everywhere. 2 days later, as you are gathering the last of your supplies, clean linen, a sharp new blade, 2 burly men in the dark blue livery of the guild's enforcers block your path in the alley. They are not talkative. They simply escort you. You are brought not to the guild hall, but to a storehouse near the docks. The air smells of exotic spices, cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom, a fragrant mask for the rot of the city. Allard Gable is waiting for you, standing beside a row of neatly stacked barrels. Silas, he says, his voice as smooth as polished wood. I had hoped we had an understanding. I am a tooth puller, you say, your heart hammering against your ribs. The girl has a bad tooth. Gable smiles. A slow, predatory expression. Please. Do not insult my intelligence. You are a scribe who plays at butchery. You think in lines and angles. You believe problems can be solved. I, on the other hand, understand systems. I understand that this child's debt is a tool to ensure her family's labor for the next 10 years. Her recovery is not a desirable outcome. It is a financial liability. He picks up a small, intricately carved box from a table. You have been buying mandrake. A fool's errand. The watered-down poison your friend Finn procures would likely kill the child before the knife does. The correct dosage, the correct purity, that is an art. An art I control. He opens the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of red velvet, is a vial identical to yours, but the liquid within seems darker, purer. This is what you need, Gable says softly. And I will give it to you. You stare at him, stunned into silence. Oh, yes, he continues, his smile widening. I want you to succeed. I want you to perform your little miracle. I want you to save the child. He lets the statement hang in the air. This is not mercy. It is a move in a game you don't understand. Why, you manage to ask. Because, Gable says, closing the box with a soft click, Thomas the Weaver has 2 other children. A boy of 10 and a girl of 8. Strong, healthy children. If their sister dies of a fever, it is a tragedy. The parish is sympathetic. But if she is saved by a back-alley miracle, only to have her entire family fall into incurable debt to the man who provided the means, a debt that forces them all into my workhouse to pay it off, that is a much more powerful story, don't you think? It is a lesson in the true cost of hope. It will ensure no one else in the lie ever dreams of defying the natural order again. He holds out the box to you. Save the child, Silas. Show them all that miracles come with a price. A price that is paid to me. In exchange, you will have your life, and your grimy little trade. Refuse, and my enforcers will break those clever fingers of yours, and I will watch the girl die anyway. The choice is a venomous serpent, coiling in your gut. He is not asking you to fail. He is asking you to become the instrument of his victory, to turn an act of defiance into a public demonstration of his power. To save Eliza's life only to condemn her and her family to a different kind of death. You take the box. Your hands are steady, but inside, the last, fragile pieces of the man you once were crumble into dust. Current part characters. 8,000. Total characters, 15989. Cont. The night is a shroud. The fog rolls in from the Thames, thick and oily, swallowing the gaslight and muffling the city's eternal hum into a deadened throb. It seeps into the weaver's small room, carrying the chill of the river and the stench of decay. This is the night you operate. Eliza lies on the family's only table, which has been scrubbed raw with lye soap. She is a small, frail thing, lost in the depths of her fever, her breathing a shallow rattle. Her mother, Anya, sits in the corner, her hands twisted in her apron, her face a pale mask of terror. She has not spoken since you arrived, her fear a silent, suffocating presence. Thomas stands by the door, a sentinel guarding a tomb. You work with a deliberate, cold precision, the only part of the old Silas that remains. You lay out your tools on a piece of clean linen, the probes and scalpels from your scribe's kit, a heavy pair of pliers, and the 2 vials. One, the watered-down tincture from Finn. The other, Gable's pure, dark poison of a cure. Your mind is a battlefield. To use Finn's mixture is to risk the child's life on a gamble. To use Gable's is to guarantee her enslavement. It is the choice between a quick death and a slow one. You look at the child's swollen face, at the faint blue veins visible beneath her translucent skin. You see the shadow of the workhouse, of a life spent in drudgery, of a spirit crushed before it has had a chance to grow. And you make a third choice. A scribe's choice. A choice of measurement and calculation. You uncap both vials. Using the delicate tip of a stylus, you begin to mix them, drop by agonizing drop, on a small ceramic dish. You are not an apothecary. You have no knowledge of the true art. But you understand dilution. You understand balance. You are attempting to create a third way, a dose strong enough to work, but not so pure as to be the perfect, damning evidence of Gable's generosity. It is a desperate, arrogant gamble, born of a scribe's belief that even poison can be made to follow rules. When you are satisfied, you dip a corner of a rag into the new mixture and press it to Eliza's lips. Breathe, you whisper to the unconscious child. The earthy, sweet smell of the mandrake fills the small room. You wait, watching the frantic pulse in her neck. You watch it slow, her breathing deepening from a shallow rattle into a slow, steady rhythm. She is under. For now. Now, the work begins. Anya lets out a small, choked sob and turns her face to the wall. Thomas does not move. You bring the candle closer, its flame dancing and casting long, monstrous shadows. You tilt the child's head. This is the moment where the tooth puller's brutality and the scribe's precision must merge. The pliers are useless. The infection is deep within the jawbone. You select a tool, a fine, sharp lancet you once used for cutting feather quills. Your hand does not tremble. All the fear, all the rage at Gable, all the pity for this family, it all recedes, replaced by a cold, absolute focus. There is only the tool, the flesh, and the geometry of the problem. You make the incision inside her cheek, a swift, decisive cut. Blood wells up, dark in the candlelight. You ignore it, your other hand working with a small, curved scraper to hold the flesh back, exposing the swollen, distended bone of her jaw. You can feel the heat of the infection even through the steel of your instrument. This is the point of no return. You take a breath. The air is thick, heavy. You can hear Thomas's ragged breathing behind you, the frantic beating of your own heart. You probe the bone gently with the tip of the lancet. It is spongy, diseased. You find the softest point, the apex of the abscess. You position the blade. A clean line, you think, the old scribe's mantra. No hesitation. You press down. The blade sinks into the infected bone with a soft, grinding sound. A wave of pale, foul-smelling pus erupts from the opening, thick and yellow-green. It is the smell of death contained, of life gone wrong. The stench is overwhelming, a physical assault that makes your stomach clench. You force yourself to remain steady, using the scraper to widen the opening, to ensure the poison can drain completely. For what feels like an eternity, you work in the stinking cavern of the child's mouth, scraping, cleaning, flushing the wound with salted water. You are no longer Silas the scribe or Silas the tooth puller. You are simply a pair of hands, fighting a desperate battle against decay in the flickering light of a single candle. Finally, it is done. The swelling has already visibly reduced. The pocket of poison is empty. You pack the wound with a paste of crushed yarrow, a weak but clean herbal remedy. You stitch the incision closed with a fine needle and silk thread, your movements as precise as if you were binding a book. You step back from the table, every muscle in your body aching. The room is silent, save for the steady, sleeping breath of the child. You have done it. Against all odds, you have done it. You have stared into the face of Gable's cruel system and used your broken skills to carve out a small, defiant victory. You look at Anya. She has turned back from the wall, her eyes wide, staring at her daughter's peaceful face. A single tear traces a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Is she? She will live, you say. And for the first time in years. The words do not feel like a lie. In that moment, in that foul, candlelit room, you feel a flicker of something you had long thought buried, a sense of purpose. A fragile, dangerous thing. But the night is not yet over. And in Avignon, the dawn always comes with a price. Just as the first, gray light of morning begins to filter through the shuttered window, you hear it. The heavy, rhythmic tread of boots in the alley. A sharp, authoritative knock on the door. Thomas's face goes pale. He looks at you, his eyes filled with a new kind of dread. The dread of a bill coming due. The knock comes again, louder this time. A voice, cold and official, rings out. In the name of the Apothecaries' Guild. Open this door. Gable's lesson was about to begin. Thomas, his shoulders slumped in defeat, unbars the door. Two of Gable's enforcers fill the doorway, their bulk blocking out the meager morning light. Behind them, standing just out of the direct line of sight as if he were merely an observer, is Master Allard Gable himself. His expression is one of mild, academic curiosity. He steps into the room, his polished boots stopping just short of a puddle of bloody water on the floor. His gaze sweeps over the scene, the exhausted parents, the sleeping child on the table. The array of your tools glinting in the dawn light. He gives a small, satisfied nod. Remarkable, he says, his voice a low purr. A truly remarkable feat of craftsmanship. It seems a miracle has occurred in the lie. He looks at you, and his eyes are cold and triumphant. The child lives. Anya rushes to her daughter's side, a protective, desperate gesture. She is well. You see. We need no help from you. On the contrary. My dear woman, Gable says smoothly. You need my help now more than ever. Miracles, you see, are expensive. The rare herbs, the powerful sedatives, the guild is not a charity. He produces a scroll of parchment from within his tunic. This is the bill for services rendered. A debt incurred by Silas, here, on your behalf. A debt now transferred to you. Thomas takes the scroll. His hands, accustomed to the shuttle and loom, tremble as he unrolls it. You know what he will see. An impossible sum. An amount a weaver could not earn in 20 lifetimes. But, this is madness, Thomas stammers. We have nothing. Of course you don't, Gable replies, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple sum to a child. Which is why the guild, in its generosity, has prepared an alternative. An indenture contract. Your family's service in the guild workhouse will settle the debt. 10 years. For all of you. Including the girl, once she is strong enough. It is a clean, orderly solution. He has won. He has twisted your act of defiance into the very chains he intended to forge all along. You saved Eliza from the infection only to deliver her, and her entire family, into a decade of slavery. The lesson is complete, and you were his star pupil. You, Thomas whispers, turning to you. His face a canvas of betrayal. You did this. Before you can answer, before you can find the words to explain the impossible choice you faced, Anya steps forward. She looks not at her husband, but at you. Her eyes are clear of terror now, filled instead with a hard, cold clarity. She reaches into a small pouch at her waist and takes out a handful of coins, the fee you had agreed upon. She walks to you and presses the coins into your hand. They are cold. Thank you, tooth puller, she says, her voice devoid of emotion. You saved our daughter's life. And then she turns her back on you, gathers the sleeping Eliza into her arms, and follows her husband and the guild enforcers out into the gray morning. They do not look back. You are left standing alone in the empty, stinking room. The scent of success and the stench of utter defeat mingle in the air. You hold the coins in your palm. They are the price of a life, and the cost of your soul. You walk back to your hovel. The city is waking up around you, the mills beginning their daily grind. Nothing has changed. A family has been consumed by the system. A man's hope has been extinguished. It is just another day in Avignon. You enter your room and go to the loose floorboard. You pull it up, revealing the small pouch of your America fund. You add the weaver's coins to it. The pouch is heavy now. Heavy enough, perhaps, for passage. But the destination it represents is no longer a place on a map. It is a phantom, a ghost of a life that can never be. The idea of a new world, a clean world, is a laughable absurdity. The filth isn't in the city. It is in the very nature of men like Gable, and now, it is inside you. You push the floorboard back into place, burying the money and the dream it once held. You turn to your workbench. You meticulously clean each of your scribe's tools, wiping away the last traces of blood and pus. You anoint them with oil, your movements slow and deliberate. You wrap them in the oilcloth, a tight, final bundle. You place the bundle at the very back of a small chest, burying it beneath rags and other useless trinkets. You are burying Silas the scribe for good. Then, you pick up the heavy, crude pliers. You weigh them in your hand. They feel comfortable. Familiar. They are honest tools for a dishonest world. They promise nothing but what they deliver, a swift, brutal end to a single, localized pain. They do not deal in hope. They do not perform miracles. You sit on your stool, the pliers in your lap, and you wait. You wait for the next cry of pain from the alley. For the next desperate soul with rot in their mouth and a few worn coins in their pocket. You are no longer a man with a past or a future. You are a function. A service. A necessary evil in a city that is always, endlessly, chewing. The vibration from the mills settles into your bones, and for the first time, it feels like home. Story 2. The first rule of the world below was silence. Not the soft quiet of a library or the reverent hush of a cathedral, but a deep, pressing silence that felt like a physical weight. It was the silence of the tomb, the silence of rock and earth measured in tons, a constant reminder that you were buried. You were trespassing in a place meant only for the dead. Ilara preferred it. Up above, in the choked streets of Candia, the air was a cacophony of fear, the distant, rhythmic cough of Ottoman cannons, the frantic clang of a blacksmith's hammer repairing a shattered grate, the thin wail of a hungry child. It was the sound of a city dying by inches. Down here, there was only the sound of her own breath, the scrape of her tools, and the slow, patient heartbeat of the earth. Her world was a bubble of flickering candlelight, a halo of orange against an infinite black. The air was cool and tasted of damp stone and chalk dust. Her fingers, raw and calloused, traced the line of a fissure in the rock face. To anyone else, it was a crack. To her, it was a sentence, a line of weakness in the prose of the earth. Her father had taught her to read this language. He had been a mason, a builder. His hands had known the heft of a well-cut block, the satisfying grit of mortar, the logic of an arch that would hold for centuries. He had built. Ilara, his daughter, had learned the same language, but she spoke it backwards. She was an unbuilder. She shifted her weight, the muscles in her back and shoulders burning with a familiar, deep ache. For 3 days, she had been carving this small artery into the flesh of the Venetian defenses, a narrow passage barely wide enough for her shoulders. The goal was a minor outer bastion, a carbuncle on the Great Wall, insignificant on its own. But the men who had hired her, Cretan rebels with more fire in their bellies than sense in their heads, called it a test. A proof of concept. To Ilara, it was simply a job. A problem of mass and stress, of removing just enough so that gravity, patient and unforgiving, would do the rest. A trickle of fine dirt pattered onto her headscarf. She froze, every muscle tensed. Her gaze shot upward, to the heavy timber supports she had wedged into place hours before. The silence returned, deeper this time. It was nothing. It was always nothing. Until it wasn't. That was the second rule of the world below, the earth never warned you twice. She let out a slow, controlled breath, the cloud of it momentarily visible in the candlelight before vanishing into the dark. Her focus returned to the wall in front of her. She could feel the vibration of the city through the soles of her worn boots, a faint, constant tremor. The city lived, for now. It was the sight of the Venetian guards that had done it. 2 days before. They had been swaggering through the Placia Calergon, their red and gold livery a splash of arrogant color against the grey stone. One of them had kicked a stray dog out of his path, laughing as it yelped. In that moment, the memory had returned, not as a thought but as a physical sensation, the searing Cretan sun on her face, the smell of dust and sweat, the unbearable sound of her brother's voice breaking as he begged. And above it all, the cool, bored voice of the Venetian captain, explaining the necessity of the example. Her father, the master mason. Her brother, his apprentice. Hanged for a crime they did not commit, their bodies left to twist in the wind as a warning. As a symbol of order. She picked up her small pickaxe, its handle worn smooth by her own grip. The captain's face was a blur in her memory, but his name was etched there like a curse. Valerio. A military engineer. A man of order. The rebels had given her his name. He was now the commander of Candia's fortifications. He was here, in this city. And for the first time in 10 years, Ilara's cold, professional focus had a core of white-hot fire. This wasn't a job. It was a reckoning. The pickaxe rose and fell, biting into the rock with a sharp, satisfying chink. Each strike was a word. Each shower of stone, a syllable. She was answering the captain in the only language he had left her. Current part characters, 3998. Total characters, 3998. Kant. The rebel leader, a man named Manlius, had eyes that burned with a zealot's light. He had met her in the ruins of a bombed-out bakery, the air still thick with the ghost of burnt bread. "They call you the ghost of the foundations," he'd said. His voice a low rasp. "They say you can talk to the stone." Elara had remained silent, her gaze fixed on the broken wall behind him, noting the poor quality of the mortar. A cheap shortcut. That's why it had failed so spectacularly. "We don't need you to talk to it," Manlius continued, leaning closer. "We need you to tell it to fall. The Ottomans press harder every day. We need to show the Venetians they are not safe behind their walls. We need to break their spirit." "Spirit is not a load-bearing material," Elara had replied, her voice rough from disuse. "What is the target?" "The Bembo Bastion. A small tooth in the lion's mouth, but if we can pull it, the jaw will feel it." He spoke in metaphors, a luxury she couldn't afford. She dealt in physics. Payment? The satisfaction of seeing the Lion of St. Mark humbled. And this? He slid a small, heavy pouch across the dusty table. It clinked with the sound of Venetian silver. Enough to live on for a month. Enough to buy passage away from this dying island, if there were any ships left brave enough to run the blockade. She had ignored the pouch. "The commander of the fortifications. Who is he?" Manlius had paused, a flicker of surprise in his fiery eyes. "A new man. Arrived last year. Captain Valerio. An engineer, they say. Brilliant, but arrogant. Why?" Elara had simply nodded, the name settling into the cold hollow of her chest. "I will need 3 barrels of powder. The good powder from the naval stores, not the damp rubbish you use in your muskets. And I will need a man. Someone old, who knows when to keep his mouth shut." That man was Nikos. He was waiting for her now at the entrance to the old cistern that served as her base of operations. His face a roadmap of wrinkles and cynicism. He was chewing on a piece of dried goat meat, the smell sharp and gamey. "The girl returns from her burrow," he grunted, not bothering to get up. "Did the rocks confess their sins?" "They told me they are tired of holding up this city," Elara said, setting down her tools. The sound of metal on stone echoed in the vast, damp space. Nikos spat a piece of gristle onto the ground. "The rocks are tired. The people are tired. I am tired. Only the Turks seem to have endless energy." He looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "You were down there too long today. Thirst for revenge makes you reckless. Focus makes me efficient," she corrected him, pulling a skin of water from her pack and drinking deeply. The water was stale and warm, but it was wet. "There is a difference between focus and obsession, little mouse. Focus helps you see the crack in the stone. Obsession makes you forget the ceiling above your head is also made of stone." He had been a sapper in his youth, fighting the Venetians long before Elara was born. He had seen tunnels collapse, had watched friends suffocate in the dark. He did not believe in grand gestures, only in survival. "I don't intend to die down there, Nikos." "No one ever does," he said, and returned to his meat. Their work fell into a rhythm dictated by the world above. They worked during the heaviest cannonades, the thunder from the Ottoman siege guns providing a cloak of noise for their own subterranean violence. Elara was the architect, the mind. She mapped the tunnels, calculated the loads, and chose the placement of the charges. Nikos was the muscle and the caution. He shored up the tunnels with timber scavenged from wrecked buildings. His weathered hands expert at judging the groan of wood under strain. He was her anchor to the world of consequence, a constant, grumbling reminder of all the ways they could die. Days blurred into a cycle of darkness, dust, and aching muscles. Elara felt more at home in the tunnel than she did in the city. The tunnel was a place of pure logic. Action and reaction. Cause and effect. Up above, there was only chaos, patriotism, and lies. Down here, the truth was simple: remove enough support, and even the proudest wall will fall. The work was almost complete. The main chamber was hollowed out directly beneath the bastion's foundation, a cavity of hungry darkness waiting for its meal of gunpowder. Tomorrow, she told Nikos, her voice echoing slightly in the passage. We place the charges tomorrow. Nikos looked up from the fuse he was cutting, his face grim in the lamplight. Then pray to whatever god you have left, girl. Because once we light this candle, all of hell will know where we are. Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 7998. Kant. The powder was a living thing. Kept in tightly sealed wooden barrels, it had a sharp, mineral smell that clung to the back of the throat. Elara handled it with a reverence she normally reserved for the laws of physics. She and Nikos moved the barrels through the winding tunnel, a slow, painstaking procession. Each scrape of wood against rock was a potential spark, a potential end. The silence in the tunnel was now charged with a new tension, the hum of contained energy. They packed the chamber methodically, arranging the barrels in a precise pattern designed to direct the blast upwards and outwards, to lift the foundation before shattering it. Elara worked with the intense focus of a surgeon, her hands steady, her mind clear. This was her element. The rage that fueled her was banked now, channeled into the cold, clean lines of her calculations. Revenge was an art, and its canvas was the earth beneath her enemy's feet. The fuse, she said, her voice a low murmur. Nikos handed her the long, slow-burning cord. He had waterproofed it with a mixture of tallow and resin. His own secret recipe. It would burn reliably, even in the damp air. They laid a single, continuous line from the powder chamber back towards the cistern, a long, grey serpent promising a fiery birth. It is done, Nikos said, wiping a sleeve across his sweating brow. He looked older in the lamplight, the shadows carving deep gullies into his face. All this for one cracked wall. It's a start, Elara whispered, looking back down the tunnel towards the packed chamber. It felt like the heart of her own anger, waiting to beat for the first and last time. The explosion was not a loud bang, but a deep, resonant thump that was felt more than heard. It was a giant's fist punching up from the depths of the earth. Elara, watching from a hidden vantage point in a ruined bell tower 2 streets away, felt the vibration travel through the stone floor and up her legs. For a moment, nothing happened. The Bembo bastion stood as it always had, a monument to Venetian arrogance. The rebel, Manolis, standing beside her, let out a curse. It failed. Wait, Elara commanded, her eyes narrowed. Then, it began. A web of cracks, fine as a spider's thread, appeared at the base of the bastion. The cracks widened, spreading upwards like dark lightning. A section of the wall seemed to bulge outwards, as if taking a slow breath. Then, with a sound like tearing linen on a colossal scale, the entire face of the bastion detached itself and collapsed into a roiling cloud of dust and debris. The sound wave hit them a second later, a physical blow that rattled the teeth. Manolis let out a triumphant roar, raising a fist to the sky. But Elara was not watching the bastion. She was watching the building next to it. An old tenement, its foundations weakened by the shock wave, shuddered violently. A long, dark fissure raced up its side. With a tired groan, the tenement's northern wall peeled away, revealing the rooms within like a child's dollhouse just before the entire structure imploded, vanishing into the spreading cloud of white dust. Did you see that? Manolis yelled over the din, glorious. A masterpiece of destruction. Elara didn't answer. She could still see the dollhouse rooms in her mind's eye. A table set for a meal that would never be eaten. A child's cot. A tapestry hanging askew. People had been in there. Cretins. The very people Manolis claimed to be liberating. Her masterpiece had not been precise. It had been a sledgehammer blow, and she had not controlled where all the pieces fell. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. The consequences of her success arrived quickly. Captain Valerio was not a man to be trifled with. On his desk, deep within the command center of the Palazzo Ducale, he studied the reports. His subordinates spoke of a lucky Ottoman mortar strike, a freak accident. Valerio dismissed them with a wave of his hand. He was an engineer. He knew what a mortar shell could do, and this was not it. Mortars scarred and pitted, they did not disembowel. He walked the site himself, ignoring the chaos of the rescue efforts. His sharp eyes scanned the crater, the angle of the collapse, the pattern of the debris. He picked up a piece of shattered foundation stone. On its underside was a faint, black residue. He brought it to his nose. Gunpowder. Not the crude, inconsistent mix used by the Ottomans, but something finer. More potent. This was not an attack from the outside, he said quietly to his aide. A young lieutenant with nervous eyes. This was a rot from within. He looked at the collapsed tenement, at the grieving families being pulled from the rubble. Our enemy is not just clever, he murmured, his voice hardening. They are ruthless. Or they are clumsy. Find out which. He gave the order. The city's well-diggers, sewer workers, and his own corps of military engineers were to begin a systematic survey of the ground beneath the city walls. They were to listen, to probe, to search for any anomaly, any hollow space. Valerio stood on the ruins of the Bembo bastion, the symbol of his first failure in Candia, and stared out at the city. He didn't know who his opponent was, but he could feel them. A ghost in the foundations. A mind that thought in stone and shadow. And a duel had just been declared. Current part characters, 3999. Total characters, 11,997. Kant. The duel began in silence and darkness. Valerio's world became a tapestry of maps and geological surveys. He meticulously charted every known cellar, every ancient aqueduct, every forgotten cistern beneath Candia. He created a new kind of army, not of soldiers with pikes, but of men with shovels and listening devices, simple acoustic horns they could press against the ground to detect the faint, rhythmic scrape of a sapper's tool. He was a spider, spinning a web of ordered surveillance to catch the ghost. Down below, Elara felt the change immediately. The work on her main project, the grand, ambitious tunnel towards the Martinengo bastion, became infinitely more dangerous. The city above was no longer just a source of ambient noise, it was a listening ear. They are hunting us, Nico stated. His face grim. He had just returned from a scouting trip to the surface, disguised as a beggar. I saw them. Engineers, measuring the ground near the west gate. They are not fools. Which means we must be smarter, Elara replied, though a new coil of fear tightened in her gut. She studied the maps her father had left her, parchments detailing the city's underbelly with a mason's intimate knowledge. The old Roman aqueduct. Here. She pointed a dirt-stained finger at a faint line on the map. It runs beneath the main wall. It's collapsed in sections, but if we can clear it, it will hide the sound of our digging. Their progress slowed to a crawl. Every shovelful of dirt was removed with painstaking care. They worked in shorter bursts, followed by long periods of listening, their ears pressed against the cold, damp earth. The darkness was a living entity now, filled with the ghosts of sounds. Was that the trickle of water, or the scrape of a Venetian shovel? Was that the settling of the earth, or the footstep of a soldier in a countermine above? Paranoia became their constant companion. Elara's internal world shrank until it was only the tunnel, the maps, and the burning image of Valerio's unseen face. He was her nemesis. Her other half. A man she had never met, but whose mind she felt pressing against hers in the subterranean dark. She began to think like him, to anticipate his moves. He would expect her to take the most direct route. So she would create a false tunnel, a decoy to draw his attention, while her real work continued on a deeper, more difficult path. The decoy was a masterpiece of deception. They dug a short, shallow tunnel, leaving behind just enough evidence to be found, a dropped tool, a few careless shovel marks. Then they collapsed the entrance and retreated, starting their real work 50 feet away. It worked. A week later, Nikos returned from the surface with news. They found something near the Panigale Gate. The whole area is swarming with Venetian engineers. They are congratulating themselves. A rare, thin smile touched Ilara's lips. Good. Let them. But their small victory was short-lived. The work was taking too long. The rebels were growing impatient. Manlius cornered her one night near the cistern entrance, his fiery eyes full of accusation. A month has passed, and all you have done is pull down one small wall and stir the hornet's nest. The Ottomans are preparing a major assault. We need the Martinengo down. Now. You cannot rush the breaking of a mountain, Manlius, Ilara said coldly. Your impatience will get us all killed. It is your obsession with this Captain Valerio that slows you. This is not your personal vendetta. It is a war. It is my vendetta that ensures I will not fail, she snapped back, her voice like flint. You want a hole in the wall. I want to collapse the heart of their defense. My way will take longer. But it will be final. Now get out of my sight and let me work. Manlius left, muttering curses, but his words stung. Was she being reckless? Was her hatred for Valerio clouding her judgment? She pushed the thoughts aside. Doubt was a luxury she could not afford in the darkness. The real tunnel was a nightmare. They hit a section of unstable, waterlogged soil that threatened to collapse at any moment. They had to work in waist-deep, freezing mud, shoring up the walls with every foot of progress. The air grew foul, thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. Ilara felt a persistent cough developing in her chest. Nikos's old joints ached constantly. They were living like rats, fueled by stale bread, brackish water, and sheer, stubborn will. One evening, as they rested, Nikos held up a candle to the tunnel wall. A seam of pale, soft rock was visible. Chalk, he said, his voice a low rumble. We are close. The foundations of the Martinengo were laid on a chalk bed. But the Venetians will know this too. This is where they will be listening. From then on, they worked without picks, using only their hands and small trowels to scrape away the soft chalk. The silence was absolute, broken only by their own ragged breathing. It was in that silence that Ilara heard it. A sound that was not rock, not water, not her own heartbeat. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was coming from ahead, and slightly above. She froze, her hand outstretched. She looked at Nikos, her eyes wide in the candlelight. He had heard it too. His face, already pale, seemed to turn to ash. It was the sound of a countermine. Valerio had not been fooled by the decoy for long. He was here. And he was digging down to meet them. Current part characters, 39.99. Total characters, 15996. Cant. The tapping was the sound of a death clock. Every strike of the Venetian pickaxe was a second ticking away from their lives. The sound was unervingly close, a metallic whisper traveling through the dense chalk. Valerio was not just hunting them, he was boxing them in. How long? Ilara breathed, her voice barely audible. Nikos closed his eyes, his head tilted as if listening to music. He had been in this situation before. He understood the grim acoustics of subterranean warfare. They are above us, and moving faster than we are. The chalk is soft for them too. A day. Maybe less. They will break through by morning. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at Ilara's composure. To be caught down here was not just to be killed, but to be buried alive. To be sealed in a tomb of your own making. We have to go. Now. And the Martinengo? Nikos's voice was flat, devoid of his usual cynicism. It was the voice of a man facing a final, professional problem. All this work. The powder. The powder is useless if we are dead. Elara hissed, grabbing her pack. The rebels will call you a coward, Nikos said, not moving. They will say you lost your nerve. Let them. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing in the lamplight. I am not dying for their glory, Nikos. I am not dying in this hole. He looked at her, his gaze steady. This was never about their glory. This was about your revenge. Are you ready to abandon it, little mouse? To let the captain win? His words struck her like a physical blow. To flee now would be to admit defeat. To let Valerio, the man who had destroyed her life, stand victorious on his unbroken wall. The rage she had so carefully channeled into her work surged, hot and blinding. No. She had come too far. We finish it, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. We finish it now. We don't have enough time to set the full charge, Nikos argued, his pragmatism returning. We can't place the barrels, run the fuse. We don't need the barrels, Elara interrupted, her mind racing, calculating angles and possibilities. We need a catalyst. She grabbed one of the smaller satchels of powder they used for clearing minor rockfalls. We place this here, at the weakest structural point. We won't bring the whole bastion down. But we will crack its foundation. We will create a wound that will fester. A wound that he will have to spend months trying to repair. It was a compromise. A desperate improvisation. Not the catastrophic collapse she had dreamed of, but a crippling blow. A message. Nikos nodded slowly. A smaller charge means a shorter fuse. We'll have minutes, not hours, to get out. Minutes are all we need. The work was frantic. The tapping from above grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a whisper, it was a conversation, a series of sharp, metallic questions. Asterisk, where are you? We are coming, asterisk. They packed the powder deep into a fissure beneath a key support stone, working with a desperate, silent urgency. Elara's hands were slick with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she packed the last of the powder into the crack, she heard a new sound. A scraping, followed by a shower of fine dust from the ceiling directly above them. They had been found. Go, she yelled at Nikos, grabbing the short fuse. Light the decoy fuse at the junction. It will buy us a few seconds. Nikos didn't hesitate. He scrambled back down the narrow tunnel while Elara worked the flint and steel, her knuckles clumsy with haste. A spark caught. The fuse hissed to life, a tiny, sputtering star eating its way towards the powder. She didn't wait to watch. She turned and ran, scrambling on all fours through the suffocating darkness. The ground behind her erupted, not with the deep, resonant boom she expected, but with a sharp, cracking roar. The tunnel convulsed. The air was punched from her lungs. She was thrown forward, her head slamming against the tunnel wall. The world dissolved into a chaotic swirl of pain, roaring sound, and absolute blackness as her candle was extinguished. She came to, coughing, the air thick with acrid smoke and the taste of blood. Her head throbbed. The tunnel behind her was gone, collapsed into a solid wall of rubble. The tapping had stopped. But from the direction Nikos had gone, she heard a new sound. The splintering of timber, followed by a low, grinding rumble. A sound she knew all too well. A secondary collapse. Nikos, she screamed, her voice raw. Only the silence answered. The deep, pressing silence of the tomb. He was gone. Buried. Another victim of the earth's brutal indifference. The victory, if it could be called that, was hers alone. And it tasted of ash. She was alone in the dark, the architect of a wound, with the ghost of her mentor and the echo of her own failure for company. Up above, Captain Valerio felt the tremor through the floor of his command post. It was weaker than he expected, a muffled cough instead of a roar. A report came minutes later. They had breached the rebel tunnel, but it was empty. The sappers had triggered a small charge and collapsed the passage, escaping. At the same time, another section of tunnel near the cistern had caved in. It was a failure. The ghost had slipped through his net. But as his engineers surveyed the damage to the Martinengo bastion, they found it. A deep, jagged crack running 40 feet along the foundation. Not a fatal wound, but a serious one. A wound that would require constant attention, manpower, and resources to prevent from spreading. Valerio stood before the crack, his gloved hand tracing its edge. It was an insult. A signature, written in broken stone. The duel was not over. It had just become more personal. Current part characters, 3995. Total characters, 19991. Kant. Grief was a weight Elara could not tunnel under. It filled the hollow spaces inside her, heavier than stone, colder than the mud she had waded through. Nikos was gone. His cynical voice, his pragmatic warnings, his steady presence, all of it erased. She was truly alone now, a ghost haunting her own life. The victory at the Martinengo felt like a mockery. She had wounded the lion, but the beast had taken its pound of flesh. She returned to Manolis and the rebels. Her face a mask of cold fury. They celebrated her as a hero. They slapped her on the back and offered her wine, their faces flushed with the thrill of a successful blow against their masters. They did not see the hollowness in her eyes. A masterstroke. Manolis declared, raising his cup. Valerio is running in circles. His engineers are like ants on a disturbed hill. Now is the time to strike again. Harder. Elara looked at him, at his easy, triumphant smile, and felt a profound disconnect. They saw a victory. She saw a dead old man and a crack in a wall. I need more powder, she said, her voice flat. Double the last amount. And I need maps of the sewer systems beneath the Palazzo Ducale. A hush fell over the room. The Palazzo was the heart of Venetian power, Valerio's own command center. It was a brazen, almost suicidal target. The Palazzo? Manolis breathed, his eyes wide. By the saints, girl, you have a lion's heart. I have nothing left to lose, Elara corrected him. It was the truest thing she had ever said. Her new plan was born of rage and grief. It was no longer a strategic calculation. It was an act of annihilation. She would not just crack the foundation of the palace, she would sink it. She would bury Valerio and his command staff under 100,000 tons of marble and arrogance. The sewers were a different kind of hell. A labyrinth of brick-lined tunnels, slick with algae and centuries of filth. The stench was overpowering, a thick, gagging miasma of rot and excrement that clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. Rats, bold and fat, scurried in the darkness, their eyes gleaming in her lamplight. Nikos would have hated this. He had a peasant's appreciation for clean air. The thought of him brought a fresh pang of loss, which she immediately converted into fuel for her anger. She found the junction she was looking for directly beneath the palace's central courtyard. The main sewer line, a vaulted tunnel 10 feet high, was a river of sludge. But crossing it, older and smaller, was a forgotten freshwater conduit. Long since dry. It was a perfect artery leading straight to the heart of her enemy. Working alone was a slow, terrifying madness. Every sound was magnified. The drip of water sounded like a footstep. The scuttling of a rat sounded like the scrape of a Venetian shovel. She slept in short, fitful bursts, her pickaxe clutched to her chest, dreaming of collapsing tunnels and Nikos's accusing eyes. The isolation gnawed at her. There was no one to check her calculations, no one to steady her hand, no one to tell her she was pushing too far. Her obsession became her only companion, whispering to her in the dark. She spent weeks mapping the substructure of the palace, drilling small test holes, analyzing the load-bearing walls. She was no longer just a sapper, she was a geologist of revenge. She discovered the palace's secret weakness. Like much of Candia, it was built on a bed of soft chalk, but one wing, the one housing Valerio's command center, sat perilously close to a deep, natural sinkhole that had been filled in centuries ago. If she could liquefy the soil around that sinkhole with a sufficiently powerful and directed blast. The plan was brilliant. It was also insane. It required a massive amount of powder, placed with a surgeon's precision. A single miscalculation and she would entomb herself forever. Meanwhile, Valerio was not idle. The attack on the Martinengo had wounded his pride. He saw it not as a military setback, but as a personal insult from a skilled, unseen rival. He became obsessed. He neglected his other duties, his mind consumed with the hunt for the ghost. He pored over the old city maps, the same ones Alara was using, his sharp mind looking for the patterns. The hidden pathways. He, too, discovered the forgotten freshwater conduit. He didn't know where it led, but he knew it was a vulnerability. He couldn't risk sending his men into the unstable sewer system. So he did the next best thing. He set a trap. He ordered his engineers to drill a series of small, concealed shafts down into the conduit from a secure cellar above. They were to lower listening devices. And something else, canisters of quicklime. At the first confirmed sound of digging, they were to flood the conduit with the caustic powder. It wouldn't kill the sapper instantly, but it would blind them, burn their lungs, and turn their subterranean world into a choking, white hell. It was a cruel, elegant trap, born of a cold, logical mind. Unaware, Alara was preparing for her final act. She had painstakingly moved the barrels of powder into position. Her body screaming with exhaustion. Her cough was worse, a deep, wet rattle in her chest. Her hands were a mass of cuts and blisters. She was a wraith, a creature of dirt and darkness, held together only by the sheer force of her will. She stood in the chamber she had carved out beneath the palace, the barrels of powder stacked around her like silent, waiting gods. All that was left was to lay the fuse. As she knelt to uncoil the cord, she heard it. Not a tapping this time. A faint, metallic squeak from directly above. The sound of a winch. She looked up. A small, dark hole, no bigger than her fist, had appeared in the ceiling of the conduit. Then another. And another. A fine, white powder began to drift down, catching the candlelight like malevolent snow. It touched her hand, and she felt a sudden, searing heat. Quicklime. She understood instantly. He had found her. He had been waiting for her. It was a trap. The ghost had walked into the spider's web. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror, colder and heavier than any rock, crashed over her. She was caught. Current part characters, 3998. Total characters, 23989. Kant. For a heart-stopping second, Alara was paralyzed. The white dust swirled in the beam of her lantern. A silent, beautiful vortex of death. The burning on her skin was a physical manifestation of Valerio's mind, cold, precise, and utterly ruthless. He hadn't tried to bury her. He had chosen to blind her, to suffocate her, to make her own workspace her execution chamber. It was a punishment designed by an engineer for an engineer. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The terror broke, replaced by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. Rage, clean and sharp as a shard of glass, cut through her fear. He would not take her like this. She would not die choking on his dust in his trap. She scrambled backwards, away from the falling lime, pulling her headscarf up over her nose and mouth. The air was already becoming thick, the dust catching in her throat, making her cough. Each cough was a spasm of pain. She had to move. She had to think. The fuse. The plan. It was impossible now. She could never lay the long fuse and escape before the conduit became impassable. Her grand design to sink the palace was dead. Valerio had won. Or had he? Her eyes, stinging and watering, darted around the chamber. The barrels. The powder. The tools. Her mind, honed by years of calculating stress and breaking points, raced past the despair. The trap was the conduit. The trap assumed she needed to escape through the conduit. But what if she didn't? A new plan formed, born not of meticulous planning but of raw, cornered animal desperation. It was a suicidal, insane idea. But it was her idea. Not his. She grabbed her pickaxe and lunged not towards the exit, but towards the wall of the chamber itself, the wall that separated her from the filled-in sinkhole. She ignored the burning lime, the choking air. She swung the pickaxe with all the strength left in her exhausted body. The chalky rock fractured. She swung again and again, her movements frantic, fueled by a terrifying clarity. She was not trying to escape. She was trying to break through. She needed to breach the chamber, to expose the powder directly to the unstable soil of the sinkhole. Then she wouldn't need a long fuse. She would only need a very, very short one. The lime was thicker now, a white fog that reduced visibility to a few feet. She could hear muffled shouts from above. They knew she was still alive. They were probably lowering more canisters. Time was gone. There were only seconds. With a final, desperate heave, her pickaxe broke through the wall. A cascade of damp, black soil poured into the chamber. It smelled of deep earth, of decay and time. The sinkhole. She stumbled back to the nearest barrel, her lungs on fire. She ripped the lid off, plunging her arm into the cool, granular powder. She pulled out a handful, leaving a trail of it as she scrambled towards the breach she had made. She didn't have a fuse. She didn't need one. She pulled out her flint and steel. Her hands were shaking violently now, not from fear, but from a terrifying, ecstatic sense of finality. She looked at the swirling white lime, at the dark, waiting soil. She thought of her father, of his proud hands building the walls she had sought to destroy. She thought of Nikos, buried in the dark because of her pride. And she thought of Valerio, up there in his clean, ordered room, listening for her dying screams. He would not hear them. He would hear her answer. "This is my language," she rasped. Her voice a shredded whisper. She struck the flint. A single, defiant spark flew into the air, a tiny sun in the white darkness. It landed on the trail of black powder. For Ilara, the world did not end in a roar. It ended in a flash of silent, transcendent white light that consumed everything. For Captain Valerio, standing in the cellar above, the world ended in a cataclysm. The ground didn't just shake. It vanished. The elegant, logical trap he had set was consumed by a force beyond his calculations. The floor beneath him dropped away with a soundless lurch, and for a single, horrifying moment, he was suspended in air. He saw his aide's mouth open in a scream that made no sound. He saw his perfectly ordered maps flutter upwards like startled birds. He felt a colossal, upward pressure, a giant's hand pushing him towards the heavens. Then the roar came. A sound so profound it was not merely heard but felt in the bones, in the teeth, in the very soul. It was the sound of a palace being torn from its foundations. The sound of a sinkhole remembering its hunger. The sound of a ghost writing her final, indelible signature upon the face of his world. The Palazzo Ducale did not crumble. It sank. The entire west wing, command center and all, slid downwards and inwards, imploding into the newly liquefied earth with a final, grinding sigh. The pride of Venetian engineering, the heart of its military power in Candia, was gone, swallowed by a pit of mud and rubble. Valerio, his body broken, was swallowed with it, his last sensation not of pain, but of a profound, shattering bewilderment. He had been so certain of his logic. He had failed to account for an opponent who was willing to become the detonation. Current part characters. 3,995. Total characters, 27984. Kant. News of the palazzo's fall struck Candia like a physical shockwave, a psychological earthquake that did more damage than any cannon. The symbol of Venetian power, the very brain of its defense, had been surgically removed. The story that ripped through the starving, terrified city was not one of military strategy, but of divine retribution. The patron saints of Crete had finally answered their people's prayers. They whispered. The earth itself had opened up to swallow the occupiers. No one spoke of a sapper. No one knew the name Ilara. Her act was so total, so catastrophic, that it transcended human explanation and entered the realm of myth. Manlius and his rebels were stunned into silence. Their agent of chaos had delivered a blow beyond their wildest dreams, but she had vanished with it. They searched the ruins. But there was nothing to find. They declared her a martyr, a hero of the revolution who had given her life to strike at the heart of the beast. They toasted her name, even as they began to squabble over who would lead in the new power vacuum. Her sacrifice became a political tool before her body was even cold. But Ilara was not dead. She awoke to reign. A gentle, cleansing drizzle was falling on her face. She was lying on her back, looking up at a sky the color of a dirty pearl. Her body was a symphony of agony. Every inch of her felt broken, bruised, or burned. She tried to move, and a white-hot lance of pain shot through her side. She coughed, a thick, rattling sound, and tasted blood and lime. She was in the crater. The vast, muddy pit where the palazzo had once stood. The force of the blast, channeled and directed by the unique geology of the sinkhole, had not just gone up and down. A portion of it had vented sideways, through the sewer tunnels she had used. It had thrown her clear of the main collapse, a piece of human shrapnel spat out by the explosion. She had been buried under a shallow layer of mud and debris, her unconsciousness protecting her from the worst of the immediate aftermath. The rain had washed the mud from her face, allowing her to breathe. She was alive. A miracle of physics. A statistical anomaly. A cruel joke. Slowly, painfully, she dragged herself from the sucking mud. She was a thing of rags and ruin, her skin blistered, her hair matted with blood and dirt. She looked at the devastation around her. It was absolute. A gaping wound in the heart of the city, steaming in the cool air. Her great work. Her revenge. Valerio was gone. The palace was gone. And nothing had changed. The rain fell with the same indifference on the ruins of the Venetian palace as it had on the rubble of the Cretan tenement. She stumbled through the chaotic streets. No one recognized her. She was just another victim, another ghost in a city full of them. The fall of the palazzo had broken the spine of the Venetian defense. The soldiers were disorganized, their leadership decapitated. Panic was spreading. The end was near. A few days later, the final Ottoman assault came. It was less of a battle and more of a tide. The exhausted, demoralized Venetian garrison crumbled. The great walls of Candia, which had held for over 2 decades, were finally breached. Ilara watched from the shadows of a burned-out church as the Ottoman soldiers, with their curved swords and alien shouts, poured into the city. She saw them tear the winged lion banner of St. Mark from the ramparts. She saw them raise their own standard, a crescent moon against a blood-red field. The city had not been liberated. It had simply changed masters. The cheers of the Cretan rebels died in their throats as they realized their new rulers had no more interest in their freedom than the old ones had. The war was over, but the occupation continued. The machine of history had simply swapped out a broken part for a new one and ground on. Ilara's revenge was complete. And it was utterly, profoundly hollow. The fire of her rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, grey ash of grief and futility. She had unbuilt a palace, killed her nemesis, and changed the course of the siege. And in doing so, she had become exactly what she had fought against. A force of indiscriminate destruction that consumed the innocent and the guilty alike. She had written her answer in the language of violence, and the only reply was more violence. She found the ruins of her family's old home. Nothing remained but a few foundation stones. The stones her father had laid. She ran her blistered hand over one, feeling the familiar texture, the mason's mark he had carved on its underside. She thought of his pride, his simple, honest belief in building things that would last. What had she built? A crater. A legacy of dust. In the weeks that followed, Candia was remade. Mosques were built over the foundations of churches. The Italian language of the occupiers was replaced with the Turkish of the new ones. The city healed over its wound, forming a new scar. And in this new city, Ilara simply vanished. She was no longer a sapper, no longer an agent of revenge. She was nothing. A woman with no name, no past, and no future. She took odd jobs, hauling rubble, cleaning stables, her face always hidden by a scarf, her eyes always downcast. She never spoke of what she had done. Her great act of defiance had made her anonymous. Her loudest shout had resulted in her total silence. Sometimes, late at night, she would walk to the edge of the great crater, the place the locals now called the Kazan, the cauldron. They said it was haunted. They said it was a place where the earth was thin, where you could hear the whispers of the damned. Ilara heard nothing. She felt nothing. She was the ghost they were afraid of, and she was hollow. She had survived. That was the final, cruelest irony. The original assassin's fate was to be erased by an anonymous death or to fade into paranoid obscurity. Her fate was worse. She was forced to live with her success, to walk every day in the ruins of her own victory. She had made history, and in doing so, had erased herself from the world of the living. She was a footnote that no one would ever read, a ghost haunting a grave of her own design, forever trapped in the silence that followed the roar. Story 3. How does one measure the edge of the world? Ilara believed it could be done with a compass and a straightedge. Her father had taught her that the world was a place of logic, a sphere governed by numbers and ratios, where even chaos was merely a complex pattern awaiting the right mind to decipher it. He had been a geometer, an architect who saw the divine not in the thunderbolts of Zeus but in the perfect harmony of a golden rectangle. In their isolated Arcadian estate, nestled among the rugged mountains that clawed at the sky, he had built for her a library of scrolls, a sanctuary of ordered lines on papyrus, while the rest of Hellas tore itself apart. The Peloponnesian War was a distant rumor to her, a clash of brutish Spartan spears and fickle Athenian naval schemes. It was a problem for men who measured the world in stadia conquered and enemies slain. Ilara measured it in the precise angle of a buttress, the graceful curve of an arch, the elegant geometry of a constellation. Her fingers, perpetually stained with the faint gray of charcoal and the deep black of squid ink, knew the texture of drawn lines better than they knew the loom. She could look at the jagged peaks surrounding their valley and see not a barrier, but a series of triangles, each with its own calculable hypotenuse. Reason, her father, Callippus, would say, his voice a soft rasp against the hum of cicadas, is the only wall that can never be breached. He had built the walls of their estate himself years ago, after a bitter political dispute had seen him withdraw from the intellectual fervor of Athens. The stones were ancient, cyclopean in their mass, fitted together with a geometer's precision. But the true defense, he insisted, was in the mind. This morning, that philosophy felt thin, as fragile as a dried leaf. A shepherd had come down from the high passes, his face pale with terror, babbling of a Spartan patrol, a heliograph winking from a distant summit, a cold, metallic eye in the impassive face of the mountains. Lycomedes, the captain of their small household guard, stood now in the atrium, his bronze cuirass dull with age, his face a roadmap of old battles. He had been with her father since before she was born. A man of the spear and shield who saw the world as a series of threats to be met with force. He looked at Ilara, her hands clutching a scroll of Euclid's theorems, and his weary eyes held a deep, pitying skepticism. "My lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your father, Lord Callippus, has taken the 5 men we can spare. He means to parley with them at the mouth of the valley." Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Parley? With Spartans? One did not reason with a wolf, one simply barred the door. He took a spear, not a scroll, she murmured, the thought a sharp, pointed thing in her mind. He is a noble, Lycomede said, though the words lacked conviction. He believes in the old codes of conduct. The old codes were dying. The war had poisoned them, leaving only the logic of survival. Elara walked to the edge of the peristyle garden, her bare feet cold on the mosaic tiles that depicted the myth of Persephone. She looked past the scent of thyme and roses, towards the gap in the mountains. Her father believed in honorable men. Elara believed in observable phenomena. And the phenomenon she observed now was a plume of dust rising against the azure sky, far too large for a returning patrol of 6. The hours that followed were a study in silence. The servants moved like ghosts, their eyes wide and fearful. Lycomede stood on the parapet of the main gate, a bronze statue of grim patience. Elara retreated to her library, the ordered world of her scrolls a mockery of the chaos gathering outside. She tried to lose herself in the elegant proofs of Pythagoras, but the lines on the papyrus seemed to writhe, transforming into marching phalanxes, the sharp points of their spears like the unforgiving angles of a poorly drawn triangle. The sun was a searing orange wound in the western sky when a single figure appeared, stumbling down the path from the valley's mouth. It was one of their men, his tunic torn, a crimson smear across his face. He collapsed before the gates, his words coming in ragged, gasping sobs that the wind carried up to the silent walls. Ambush. A trap. The Spartans had not come to parley. Lycomedes met her gaze across the courtyard, his own face ashen. In that single, shared look, the world of philosophy ended and the world of brutal geometry began. The line had been drawn. Her father, the man of reason, was dead. And the enemy, a force of unreasoning violence, was coming. That night, Elara did not weep. Grief was a luxury, a self-indulgence she could not afford. Instead, she did what her father had taught her to do when faced with an unsolvable problem. She sought data. While Lycomedes grimly prepared their paltry defense, a dozen guards, a score of terrified farmhands armed with shepherd's crooks and wood axes, Elara locked herself in the library. She did not look at the scrolls of poetry or drama. She unrolled her father's private works, the ones he called his Conversations with the Land. These were not mere maps. They were intricate topographical surveys, geological studies, architectural analyses of every ruin, every waterway, every forgotten track in their corner of Arcadia. Her father had mapped the province not for conquest, but for understanding. He had charted the winds, the patterns of erosion, the structural integrity of ancient retaining walls. He had seen the land as a living thing, with bones of stone and veins of water. Her fingers, stained with ink, traced the lines he had drawn. They were no longer abstractions. The contour lines showing the steepness of a slope were now a barrier to a heavily armed phalanx. A notation about seasonal flooding in a narrow gorge was a potential weapon. A sketch of a crumbling Mycenaean watchtower, dismissed by others as a relic, was a defensible choke point. A new kind of grief, sharp and potent, pierced her then. He had given her all the tools she needed to survive the very world he had failed to understand. He had armed her not with a spear, but with knowledge. A messenger arrived at dawn, a Spartan this time, arrogant and sneering under a flag of truce. He carried a message from his commander, a General Kratos. The terms were simple, unconditional surrender. The estate would be seized, its people enslaved. Lady Elara would be taken as a prize of war for the general's personal pleasure. Lycomedes' hand tightened on the hilt of his xiphos, his knuckles white. He looked at Elara, expecting her to collapse, to accept the inevitable. She was a scholar, a child of soft living. Elara looked at the Spartan, her gaze as cool and steady as the polished marble floor. "Tell your general," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "that this house is built upon logic. And logic dictates that we will not be surrendering today." The Spartan laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A woman's logic. You will be dead or broken by midday, girl." As he turned to leave, Elara spoke again. And tell him to mind the western pass. The ground is unstable. A heavy tread can cause rockfalls. It was a guess, a gambit based on a half-remembered note on one of her father's scrolls. A bluff. The Spartan spat on the ground and departed. Lycomede stared at her, a flicker of something new in his eyes, not pity, but confusion. My lady? What was that? Elara rolled up a large topographical map, its edges worn from use. That, Captain, she said, her voice devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul, was the first move in a different kind of war. He has his hoplites. I have the land itself. Now, gather the men. You will teach them how to hold a shield. I will teach them where to stand. The skepticism on Lycomede's face did not vanish, but it was now shadowed by a sliver of desperate hope. He had spent his life in a world of bronze and muscle. He was about to enter a world of ink and angles. The first test came sooner than she expected. Kratos was a man of brute efficiency. He wasted no time. Sending a detachment of 50 men not through the main valley road, but through the western pass Elara had warned him about, likely assuming her words were a trick to divert him from a weaker point. It was the move of a commander who believed his opponent was both stupid and dishonest. Elara stood on the estate's highest tower, a small, solitary figure against the vastness of the mountains. She did not watch the Spartans. She watched the land. Beside her, Lycomedes fidgeted, his hand reflexively gripping his sword. They will be upon us in an hour, my lady. My men are ready at the gate. They will not reach the gate, Elara said, her eyes fixed on a specific point on the mountainside, a place where a steep scree slope met a narrow, winding track. She had studied it for hours on her father's charts. The geological notes had been clear. Unstable schist formation. Prone to slippage after heavy rains or significant vibration. There had been no rain, but Elara was counting on a different kind of vibration. I have sent 5 shepherds, the ones who know those rocks best, she explained, her voice low and calm. They are not to fight. They are to create a disturbance above the pass. They have pry bars from the quarry. They are to dislodge the keystone. Keystone? Lycomedes frowned. That is a term for arches. All of nature is an arch, Captain, Elara murmured, more to herself than to him. You just have to find the stone that bears the load. They waited. The silence was thick, broken only by the incessant wind whistling through the crenellations. Below, in the courtyard, the handful of armed men shifted nervously. They were farmers and servants, not soldiers. Their trust in her was as fragile as a spider's thread. Then, a low rumble, like distant thunder, echoed through the valley. It grew, deepening into a grinding roar. Elara watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, as a plume of dust erupted from the mountainside. The scree slope gave way, a river of rock and gravel pouring down onto the narrow track below. It was not a cataclysmic landslide, but it was enough. The pass was completely blocked. Shouts of alarm, thin and reedy at this distance, drifted up from the Spartan column, now thrown into confusion. Lycomedes stared, his mouth agape. He had seen battles, sieges, the clash of thousands. He had never seen a mountain turned into a weapon. It will not hold them for long, Elara said, already turning away from the tower's edge. A day. 2 at most. But it bleeds their time and their morale. And it teaches them that the ground they walk on is my ally, not theirs. She walked back towards the library, leaving Lycomedes alone on the tower. He looked from the blocked pass back to the slender girl disappearing into the shadows of the colonnade. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't brandished a weapon. She had simply read a map and moved a mountain. A cold dread, mingled with a terrifying awe, began to settle in his soul. This was not the kind of war he knew how to fight. For the next few days, the estate existed in a state of suspended animation. Kratos's main force remained camped at the valley's entrance, his arrogance clearly warring with a newfound caution. He sent out scouting parties, which Alara tracked from her tower, marking their movements on her maps like a philosopher plotting the erratic orbits of lesser planets. Her relationship with Lycomedes was changing. The captain no longer offered tactical advice. He asked for instructions. He would come to the library, his large, scarred hands looking clumsy and out of place among the delicate scrolls, and listen as Alara pointed to a contour line, a stream bed, a forgotten goat track. "They will try this ridge next," she would say, her finger tapping the papyrus. "The approach is concealed by a stand of pines, but the ground here is marshy. I have had the shepherds divert the upper spring. By nightfall, it will be a quagmire. They will lose their footing, their cohesion. A small group of men with slings, positioned here, can harass them and retreat before they can form a line." And so it would be. Lycomedes would take her plans, born from ink and memory, and translate them into the grim reality of stone and flesh. His men, a motley collection of farmers and herders, began to look at Alara with a kind of reverence. She was not a warrior queen, but something stranger, an oracle who read the future not in the entrails of birds, but in the lines of the earth. But Alara felt no triumph. Each small victory was a new wound in her soul. She had been raised to revere the principles of creation, of building things that were balanced and beautiful. Now, she was dedicating her every thought to the principles of deconstruction. She used her knowledge of hydrology to create bogs, her understanding of geology to trigger rockfalls. She was turning her father's conversations with the land into a manual for its violation. One evening, Lycomedes found her in the library, staring at her father's detailed plan for a new aqueduct, a graceful structure meant to bring fresh water to the lower villages. "Another strategy, my lady?" he asked. His voice softer now, stripped of its earlier skepticism. Alara didn't look up. "This was a plan to bring water to a village," she whispered. "I was just thinking about how the same principles could be used to weaken the foundations of the old bridge by the river crossing if we diverted the main channel." The internal conflict was a chasm inside her. To save her home, she had to become a mirror of the very destructive force she was fighting. She was winning, but she was losing a part of herself with every victory. She was proving her father's philosophy, that reason was the ultimate wall, but by methods he would have found abhorrent. The stalemate could not last. Kratos was a Spartan. Patience was not among his virtues. The reports from his frustrated scouts, filled with tales of phantom attackers and treacherous ground, finally broke his composure. He gathered his full force, over 300 hardened hoplites, and began a slow, deliberate march up the main valley road. He would crush the impudent girl and her nest of farmers with overwhelming force. There would be no more tricks, no more maneuvering. Just a straightforward siege. The news spread through the estate like a fever. This was the final test. The rockfalls and quagmires were useless now. It would be their dozen professional guards and 50-odd armed servants against a legion of Sparta's finest. The household fell into a panicked despair. Men began to talk of surrender, of slipping away into the mountains. It was Lycomedes, his newfound faith in Alara absolute, who quelled the dissent. "Do you trust the strength of your own arms, or the mind of the woman who has kept you alive for a week against a foe that should have slaughtered you in an hour?" he roared in the courtyard. "I will follow her plans to the gates of Hades if I must." That evening, Alara called him to the library. The air was thick with the smell of old papyrus and burning olive oil from the lamps. She had a single, massive scroll spread across the main table. It was not a map of the valley, but a detailed architectural drawing of the estate itself. "He thinks the battle will be for the walls," she said. Her voice quiet. "He is wrong. The battle is for the water." She pointed to a complex series of lines on the drawing. "My father was fascinated by the old Minoan water systems. He built this estate with a network of cisterns, channels, and overflows that would have been the envy of Knossos. The main river is fed by 3 mountain springs. All 3 are channeled by a single, ancient dike a half-day's walk upstream." Lycomedes leaned closer, his eyes struggling to understand the intricate drawing. "A dike? A very old, very large earthen dam, reinforced with stone, Elara confirmed. My father studied its weaknesses for years. He wrote that if the main sluice gate were to be sabotaged during the spring melt, the resulting flood would be catastrophic. She looked at him, her eyes dark pools of grim resolve. Kratos has made his camp in the low-lying field directly beside the river. The only flat ground large enough for his army. It is the perfect place for a siege. It is also a death trap. Lycomedes straightened up, a slow, terrible understanding dawning on his face. He was a soldier. He understood killing with a sword, a spear. This was something else entirely. It was elemental, an act of gods, not mortals. It is a high-risk plan, Elara continued, her voice clinical, as if discussing a mathematical proof. The timing must be perfect. The sabotage requires precision. And if we fail, we will have exhausted our last hope. Who can do such a thing? Lycomedes asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elara began to roll up the scroll. I can. My father taught me how it was built. I know its flaws. And you, Captain, will come with me. I need your strength. The rest must hold the walls until dawn. They do not need to win. They only need to buy us one night. The siege began at dusk. Flaming arrows arched over the walls, thudding into the wooden shutters and packed earth ramparts. The guttural chants of the Spartan warriors echoed in the twilight, a sound designed to shatter morale. Inside the walls, Lycomedes' men, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight, held their shields and waited, their fear a palpable thing. They were a fragile shield of flesh and bronze, and their only hope was a girl and a half-mad plan miles away in the darkness. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Elara and Lycomedes, along with two of the most trusted shepherds, slipped out through a hidden postern gate, a secret known only to her father's plans. They moved like wraiths through the familiar landscape, the sounds of the distant siege at their backs a constant, terrifying drumbeat. Elara's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. Every step took her further into a moral wilderness. She thought of the water, a force of life, of cleansing, and she was about to twist it into an instrument of mass death. Was this reason? Or was it a more sophisticated form of the same brutality Kratos employed? The question gnawed at her, but she pushed it down. Survival was the only theorem that mattered now. They reached the ancient dike near midnight. It was a monstrous thing, a huge, dark shape against the star-dusted sky, a wall of packed earth and stone that held back a mountain's worth of water. The air was cold, and the sound of the water pressing against the sluice gate was a constant, deep groan. The mechanism was old, a series of bronze levers and stone counterweights. Rust and time had frozen it in place. This was where Lycomedes' strength was needed. While Elara directed them, pointing out the key structural weaknesses her father had noted, the captain and the shepherds put their shoulders to the great levers. It was grueling, terrifying work. The bronze shrieked in protest. The stone groaned. Elara, holding a single, shielded lamp, directed them with a calm she did not feel. There, she would say, her voice steady. That pin bears the most strain. If you can shear it. They worked for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of their efforts lost in the roar of the contained water. Her mind, so used to the quiet solitude of the library, was now filled with the physics of imminent collapse. She calculated the pressure, the likely trajectory of the flood, the time it would take to reach the valley floor. Her thoughts were cold, precise, and utterly divorced from the human cost. She had become an architect of destruction. With a final, shattering crack, the main locking pin sheared. The great stone gate shifted, then gave way with a sound like the world splitting open. A torrent of white water exploded from the dam, a furious, living entity unleashed. The roar was deafening. They scrambled back up the hillside, soaked and gasping, as the floodwaters began their rampage down the narrow gorge. Elara did not watch the water. She watched the sky to the east. The first, faint blush of dawn was beginning to outline the mountain peaks. The timing had been perfect. As the sun rose, its light touched a scene of biblical devastation. The Spartan camp was gone, swallowed by a muddy, churning lake. Tents, siege engines, and the bodies of men and horses were swept away in the torrent. The army, caught asleep and unprepared, had been broken not by a shield wall, but by a river. The survivors, dazed and terrified, were clambering onto any high ground they could find. Their cohesion was shattered. Their spirit was drowned. From the walls of the estate, a great cry went up from the defenders, a sound of disbelief and ecstatic relief. They had survived the night. Lycomedes led the charge from the main gate, his small force now appearing like an army of giants to the demoralized Spartans. He sought out Kratos. The general, his armor caked in mud, his face a mask of incandescent rage and utter bewilderment, stood on a small hillock, trying to rally the few men around him. Elara watched from the tower, no longer a strategist, but a witness. She saw Lycomedes engage Kratos in a brutal duel. She saw her captain, old but filled with a righteous fury, fight with the strength of a young man. And she saw him fall, a Spartan spear thrust deep into his side. In that moment, something inside Elara snapped. The cold, calculating geometer vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, protective rage. She was no longer a thinker hiding behind walls. This was her home. These were her people. Lycomedes had believed in her. She grabbed a bough from a fallen guard, her movements clumsy but driven by a fierce new instinct. She ran down from the tower and onto the parapet. She knocked an arrow, her hands shaking, but her eyes clear. She saw Kratos, standing over the fallen Lycomedes, ready to deliver the final blow. She drew the string, the motion alien to her scholar's muscles. She did not aim with her mind, with calculations of wind and distance. She aimed with her heart. The arrow flew, a dark streak against the morning light. It struck Kratos in the shoulder, a non-fatal but shocking wound. He staggered back, his roar of pain and fury echoing across the ruined valley. His men, seeing their invincible general wounded by an arrow from the walls, finally broke and fled in a mindless panic. The battle was over. In the days that followed, a strange quiet settled over the valley. The waters receded, leaving behind a scarred landscape of mud and debris. The captured General Kratos, his arm in a sling, was held in the estate's wine cellar, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, venomous silence. He could not comprehend his defeat. He had been beaten by a girl and a river. It was an impossible equation, a violation of the natural order of war. Lycomedes did not die. He lay in his chambers, tended to by Elara herself, his life hanging by a thread. His presence was a constant, painful reminder of the cost of her victory. Elara walked through the halls of her home, the scrolls in her library now seeming like relics from a different life. She had saved her people, but she felt hollowed out, as if the flood had washed away a part of her soul. She stood before her father's architectural drawings, the elegant lines and perfect proportions now seeming impossibly innocent. One afternoon, a delegation of the surviving villagers and shepherds came to her. They did not call her, my lady. They called her, Geometers, the geometer, the measurer of the earth. They did not offer her fealty as a noble, they offered her their trust as a leader. You taught us that the land could fight for us, an old shepherd said, his voice filled with awe. Now, teach us how to make it live for us again. It was then that Elara understood. Her father had been wrong. Reason was not a wall to hide behind. It was a tool, to be used. Her purpose was not merely to understand the world, but to shape it. The same knowledge that could divert a river to destroy an army could also divert it to irrigate barren fields. The same understanding of structure that could collapse a pass could also build a stronger bridge, a safer home. She did not execute Kratos. That was the old way, the way of the spear. She ransomed him back to Sparta for a shipment of grain, tools, and a promise that Arcadia would be left in peace. It was an act of pragmatic creation, not vengeful destruction. Her final victory was not on the battlefield, but in her library, months later. The great table was covered not with maps of war, but with new plans. A design for a more efficient irrigation system for the valley. A blueprint for a new granary, built into the side of a hill for natural cooling. A sketch for a small school where the children of the valley could learn to read not just the words of poets, but the language of the land. Lycomedes, leaning on a cane, his body scarred but his eyes clear, stood beside her. He looked at the intricate drawings, the elegant lines that promised a future. "Your father would be proud. Geometers," he said softly. Elara dipped her quill into the inkpot. "My father believed in a perfect, theoretical world," she replied, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I have learned that we must build our own, here in the imperfect one." She drew a new line on the papyrus, a line that was not a boundary or a weapon, but a foundation. Her legend would spread through the mountains of Hellas, a strange and whispered tale. Not of a warrior queen with a bloody sword, but of the woman who defeated a Spartan army with nothing but ink, papyrus, and a profound understanding of the world beneath her feet. She had held the line, and in doing so, she had redrawn the map of her own existence. Story 4. Did sausage always taste of regret? Klaus Richter turned the disc of meat over on his fork, the tine scraping against the tin of his mess kit. The sound was thin and sharp in the immense, frozen silence of the steppe. The sausage was a pale, uniform gray, flecked with unidentifiable white specks that were definitely not fat. It had the texture of wet cardboard and a faint, chemical smell that clung to the back of the throat. He took a bite, chewed methodically, and swallowed. It was fuel. Nothing more. He remembered sausage. Real sausage. He remembered the coarse, pork and marjoram grind of bratwurst sizzling on a grill in the village square, the skin spitting and blistering to a perfect, crackling brown. He remembered the rich, livery scent of the leberwurst his father would make, so soft it would spread like butter on the heel of a warm loaf. His father, a man whose hands were perpetually dusted with a fine white powder, could conjure magic from pig and spice. This gray disc was an insult to pigs. It was an insult to the very memory of taste. "It has calories, Sergeant," a voice piped up beside him, young and painfully earnest. Klaus looked over. Private Lucas Haas sat hunched on a crate, his new wool greatcoat still stiff, his face still holding the pink, well-scrubbed look of home. The boy was 17, a child playing at war, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and patriotic conviction. He was attacking his own gray disc with a misplaced gusto, as if eating it with enough enthusiasm could transform it into something other than what it was. "That it does, Private," Klaus said, his voice flat. He didn't have the energy to argue, nor the heart to shatter the boy's illusion just yet. The war would do that for him soon enough. Lucas, mistaking Klaus's silence for encouragement, continued. "The quartermasters do their best. It's a miracle of logistics, getting food to us all the way out here. My father says." Klaus tuned him out. He'd heard it all before. The miracle of logistics. The strength of the Reich. The indomitable spirit of the German soldier. He'd probably believed it himself, once. That was 2 winters ago. Before the frost had seeped into his bones, before he'd learned to tell the difference between the whistle of a mortar and the whistle of the wind through a shattered farmhouse. Before the food had started to lie. In the beginning, the food had been honest. The Wehrmacht had marched into this endless, flat country powered by real bread, dark and dense and full of rye. There had been tins of beef in thick gravy, blocks of real butter, and coffee that actually tasted of coffee. Those were the days of swagger and easy victories, when the war felt like a grand, unstoppable adventure. Now, the adventure was over. Now, there was only the cold and the gray, tasteless meat. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. His father's bakery in their small Bavarian village. It was a memory of warmth, a physical sensation he could almost feel against his frozen cheeks. The air, thick with the yeast and caramel scent of baking Roggenbrot. The fine, almost invisible dust of flour settling on every surface. A sacred powder. His father, His arms thick with muscle and corded with veins, plunging his hands into a mountain of dough, kneading with a rhythm that was as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. "This is life, Klaus," his father had told him once, his voice muffled by the effort. To take something simple, flour, water, salt, and turn it into something that can feed a family. That's an honest trade, Klaus scraped the last of the gray paste from his tin. An honest trade. What was his trade now? He was a specialist in the art of staying warm, an expert in the subtle language of artillery, a connoisseur of misery. "Sergeant?" Lucas was looking at him, a smear of grease on his chin. "Are you all right?" "Just thinking," Klaus said, wiping his fork on his trousers. "About home?" Klaus gave a short, humorless laugh. "Something like that." "Thinking about bread?" Lucas nodded eagerly. "Ah, yes. My mother, she bakes a hefezoff on Sundays, with raisins and almonds." "Don't," Klaus said, the word sharper than he intended. Lucas flinched. "Sergeant? Don't talk about food. Not real food. It's bad luck." Klaus stood up, the cold biting at him through the layers of wool. "Finish up. We're on watch in 10. He walked to the edge of their position, a shallow trench carved into the unforgiving earth. Before them, the world was a canvas of white and gray. Snow, flat and endless, stretching to a horizon that was indistinguishable from the low, bruised-looking sky. There was nothing. No trees, no hills, just the occasional dark scar of a bombed-out village, a skeletal finger pointing at the heavens. It was a landscape that ate light and sound and hope. Their officer, Lieutenant Ebling, was conferring with the radio operator. His face pinched and pale. Ebling was a man held together by regulations and a meticulously trimmed mustache. He approached Klaus, his boots crunching on the frozen mud. "Richter." "Lieutenant." "A directive from command." Ebling unfolded a piece of paper, his gloved fingers stiff. He didn't need to read it, the words were already etched on his face. "The pocket has been fully sealed. All units are to move to conservation protocols. Rations are to be cut by half, effective immediately." Klaus felt nothing. It was not a shock, merely a confirmation of what his gut had been telling him for weeks. The slow tightening of a noose. The quartermaster's ghost, that faceless, indifferent entity responsible for their slow starvation, had finally made its official appearance. Ebling cleared his throat. "There will be resupply. By air. The Führer will not abandon the Sixth Army." He said it like a prayer. A desperate incantation against the crushing reality of their situation. Klaus looked past the lieutenant, at Lucas, who was carefully cleaning his mess kit with a handful of snow, his movements still precise and hopeful, as if a clean tin could somehow purify the food it was about to hold. The boy was a ghost already. They all were. They were just too frozen to lie down. Klaus nodded at the lieutenant. "Of course, sir. The Führer will not abandon us." The lie tasted worse than the sausage. The days that followed bled into one another, a smear of gray drudgery punctuated by moments of stark terror. The half ration was a cruel joke. It was just enough to keep the engine of the body sputtering, but never enough to silence the gnawing, hollow ache in the pit of the stomach. Hunger became the new landscape. It was the backdrop to every thought, the flavor in every mouthful of snow they melted for water. Klaus watched Lucas begin to fade. The boy's patriotic fire, once a blazing furnace, was now a pile of dying embers. He performed his duties with a grim, silent determination, but the light in his eyes was dimming. He'd stopped talking about his mother's baking. The first lesson in their new reality came with the morning coffee. The ersatz coffee, a bitter brew of roasted acorns and chicory, was their only source of warmth. Klaus had developed a ritual: he would let the bitter grounds settle, then pour the thin, dark liquid carefully into his tin cup, leaving the sludge behind. Lucas, in his eagerness, would swill the whole thing down, grounds and all. "You'll get the shits that way," Klaus told him one morning, watching the boy grimace as he swallowed. "It's all warmth. Sergeant," Lucas mumbled, his hands shaking around the hot tin. "There's warmth, and there's what comes after." Klaus took a slow sip of his own brew. It tasted like scorched earth and despair, but it was hot. "You need to learn the difference. This place, it'll kill you with the little things." The second lesson was the bread. The loaves that arrived were dense, dark bricks that seemed to absorb light. When Klaus broke a piece off, he could see the telltale fibers of straw and something else, something gritty and pale, mixed into the grain. Sawdust. "Look," Klaus said, holding the piece out to Lucas. "The miracle of logistics." Lucas stared at the bread. He ran his thumb over the rough texture. "It's to make it go further. For the war effort. It's to make us feel full while we starve," Klaus corrected him gently. "Chew it slow. Very slow. Or you'll break a tooth." He thought of the light, airy crumb of his father's brötchen, so delicate you could crush it in your fist. He popped the piece of sawdust bread into his mouth. It tasted like a lie. It felt like chewing on a piece of the trench. The cold was a living entity, a predator that was always stalking them. It crept into their boots, their bones, their thoughts. At night, they would huddle together for warmth, the stench of unwashed bodies and fear a thick, cloying blanket. Sleep was a shallow, shivering affair, haunted by dreams of food. Klaus dreamt of his father's bakery almost every night. He would be standing before the massive brick oven, the heat a blissful wave on his face, pulling out tray after tray of perfectly golden loaves. He would reach for one, his mouth watering, and wake up with his teeth chattering, the phantom smell of baking bread a cruel torment. One afternoon, a rumor rippled through the trench. A horse from a supply wagon had slipped on the ice and broken its leg. It had been shot. The quartermasters were butchering it. Horse meat. The men reacted with a strange mixture of disgust and ravenous anticipation. That evening, their stew had dark, stringy chunks of meat floating in the thin broth. Lucas poked at a piece with his fork. "Horse," he whispered, his face pale. "Better than no meat," another soldier, a grizzled veteran named Steiner, grunted. "In the last war, we ate rats. Fat ones, from the no-man's land." Klaus fished a piece out and ate it. It was tough, Swedish, and deeply unsettling. He was eating a beast of burden. He was eating a part of their own failed war machine. He looked at Lucas, who was struggling to swallow his first bite, his throat working. Klaus saw the boy's last vestiges of civilian decency dying right there, in that mouthful of stringy horseflesh. The days wore on. The Russian artillery became more accurate. The world shrank to the length of their trench. Time was measured not in hours, but in the space between bombardments, in the dwindling number of hard biscuits in a man's pack. It was during a lull in the fighting that Klaus noticed the officer. Lieutenant Ebling, the man of regulations, was sitting alone behind a pile of rubble, secretly eating something from a small sack. Klaus watched him for a while. Ebling would look around furtively, then pop something into his mouth, chewing with a look of intense, private bliss. Curiosity, or perhaps just the primal urge of a starving man, got the better of Klaus. He approached the officer slowly. Ebling saw him and quickly hid the sack. "What is it, Richter?" he snapped, his voice tight with guilt. Klaus's eyes were fixed on the sack. "What are you eating, Lieutenant?" Ebling's face hardened. "That is none of your concern." "With all due respect, sir, when an officer is eating and his men are chewing sawdust, it becomes their concern." They stared at each other for a long moment. The rigid lines of rank and discipline seemed to melt away, leaving only two hungry men in a frozen wasteland. Ebling's facade crumbled. His shoulders slumped. "Potatoes," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My Batman, he found a hidden cellar in the village. There was a small sack left. Potatoes." The word was holy. A sacrament. Klaus imagined it, the firm, starchy flesh, the earthy smell, the simple, honest taste. A real vegetable. A piece of the earth. I have nothing to trade, Klaus said. His voice rough. Ebeling looked at him, his eyes lingering on the chain around Klaus's neck. Klaus instinctively put a hand to it. The locket. A small, silver oval. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of his wife, Anna, smiling on their wedding day. It was his last connection to that other world, to the man he used to be. The baker's son. The husband. What is that? Ebeling asked, his voice greedy. Klaus didn't answer. He just looked from the officer's hungry face to the hidden sack. He thought of Lucas, whose face was growing more gaunt each day, whose cough was getting worse. He thought of the gnawing emptiness in his own belly. What was a memory when your body was consuming itself? What was a silver locket to a starving man? Slowly, his frozen fingers fumbling with the clasp, he took off the chain. He opened the locket one last time, looked at Anna's smiling face, and then snapped it shut. He held it out to the officer. 2, Klaus said. 2 potatoes. Ebeling snatched the locket and pushed the sack towards Klaus. Klaus reached in and his fingers closed around 2 small, firm, dirt-caked orbs. They felt heavier than gold. He walked back to his position, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had sold his past for a meal. He found Lucas huddled in a corner, shivering violently. Lucas, he said softly. The boy looked up, his eyes dull. Klaus opened his hand. The 2 potatoes sat in his palm like jewels. A flicker of life returned to Lucas's eyes. How? He whispered. An honest trade, Klaus said. That night, they performed a sacred ritual. They painstakingly peeled the potatoes with Klaus's sharpened trench knife. They boiled them in their mess tins over a tiny, sputtering fire made from splinters of a broken ammunition crate. The steam that rose from the tins was the most beautiful aroma Klaus had ever smelled. It was the smell of the earth, of life, of hope. They ate them slowly, mashing the soft, hot flesh with their forks, savoring every single mouthful. It wasn't a feast. It was a communion. For a few brief, glorious minutes, they weren't starving soldiers on the verge of annihilation. They were just 2 men, eating potatoes, warm and full. As he swallowed his last bite, Klaus felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness. It was something quieter, more fragile. It was the feeling of being human again. He looked at Lucas, who had a real, genuine smile on his face for the first time in weeks. Perhaps, Klaus thought, it had been an honest trade after all. The warmth of the potatoes did not last. It was a fleeting truce in a war that hunger was determined to win. Lucas's brief recovery faded as the dysentery tightened its grip. The boy was wasting away. His skin was translucent, stretched taut over his sharp cheekbones. He spent most of his days in a feverish, shivering sleep, his dreams filled with horrors that made him cry out. The world outside their cellar became a symphony of destruction. The Russian artillery was relentless now, a constant, rolling thunder that shook the frozen earth. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and death. But for Klaus, the loudest sound was the rattling cough that tore through Lucas's frail body. The sickness stripped away the boy's last illusions. He no longer spoke of the Führer or of destiny. He whispered of his mother, of the black forest where he grew up, of a small stream where he used to catch minnows in a jar. He was a child again, lost and terrified, calling for a comfort that was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. One night, the shelling was particularly bad. The cellar trembled, and dust rained down from the cracked ceiling. Lucas was awake, his eyes wide and lucid in the flickering light of a single candle stub. "Klaus," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here." Klaus shifted closer, trying to offer what little warmth his own emaciated body possessed. "I'm so hungry." It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple, profound statement of fact. His body was cannibalizing itself, and there was nothing left to burn. "I know," Klaus said. "Do you remember, that first week? The meat and gravy? The real bread? I remember. I thought it would always be like that," Lucas whispered. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "I thought we were invincible." Klaus finished for him. Lucas nodded weakly. "Stupid." "No," Klaus said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Just young." The sickness had burned away his naivety, leaving behind a raw, terrible clarity. He was no longer a soldier. He was just a dying boy who was hungry. And Klaus, who had sold his wife's picture for a potato, had nothing left to give him. Or did he? Deep in his pack, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was his last secret. His final luxury. From a care package that had miraculously made it through months ago, before the encirclement was complete, he had saved one item. A single, perfectly preserved hardtack biscuit. It wasn't the sawdust and straw brick of their current rations. This was an older model, from a time of relative plenty. It was a simple thing, a disk of flour and water baked until it was as hard as a roofing tile, designed to outlive the man who carried it. But it was real. It was honest. It was made of nothing but flour. He had been saving it. For what, he wasn't sure. For the final, desperate moment. For a day when a single, honest crumb might be the difference between sanity and madness. He had thought it was for himself. He was wrong. "Wait," Klaus said. He reached into his pack, his fingers closing around the hard, familiar shape. He unwrapped it carefully, as if it were a holy relic. In the candlelight, it looked plain, unremarkable. But to Klaus, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Lucas's eyes followed his movements. "What is it?" "Sustenance," Klaus said. The biscuit was too hard to bite. Trying to do so would be a dental emergency. Klaus took out his bayonet. Using the pommel, he began to carefully grind a corner of the biscuit against the inside of his mess tin. It was slow, laborious work. A fine, pale powder began to accumulate in the bottom of the tin. It looked like flour. Real flour. He scooped some snow from a drift near the cellar entrance, packing it into his canteen cup. He held the cup over the candle flame until the snow melted into a few spoonfuls of gray, gritty water. He poured the water into the mess tin, stirring the biscuit powder with his finger until it formed a thin, watery paste. It was a pathetic gruel. A ghost of a meal. But it was the best he could do. "Here," he said, lifting Lucas's head. "Eat this. It's real." He brought a spoonful of the paste to Lucas's lips. The boy's mouth opened slightly. Klaus tilted the spoon. A little of the mixture trickled into Lucas's mouth. His throat worked once, twice. He coughed, a weak, rattling sound. The paste dribbled from the corner of his mouth. "Try again," Klaus urged, his voice thick. He tried again. And again. But it was no use. Lucas was too weak. His body had forgotten how to eat. He could not swallow. He looked at Klaus, his eyes full of a vast, uncomprehending sorrow. He was drowning, and Klaus was offering him water. Lucas's head lolled to the side. A faint sigh escaped his lips, a final puff of air mingling with the cold. And then he was still. The shelling outside had stopped. The silence in the cellar was absolute. It was a silence made of cold, of death, of failure. Klaus sat there for a long time, the cooling mess tin in his hand, the single, uneaten spoonful of paste staring up at him like a blind eye. He had offered his last crumb of humanity. And it had been refused. He looked at the biscuit, still clutched in his other hand. His stomach cramped with a pain that had nothing to do with hunger. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the biscuit to his own mouth. He did not bite it. He just pressed it to his lips, feeling the hard, unyielding honesty of it. Then he wrapped it carefully in its oilcloth and placed it back in his pack. He sat in the dark with the dead boy, a baker's son with a pocket full of inedible bread, waiting for a dawn that he no longer cared to see. Surrender was not a dramatic act. There was no white flag, no formal declaration. It was simply an end to the noise. One morning, the thunder of the artillery was replaced by an eerie quiet, and then by a new sound, the crunch of boots on snow, and voices speaking a language that was not German. Klaus emerged from the cellar, blinking in the pale, watery sunlight. He was a wraith, a scarecrow made of dirty wool and bone. He joined a shambling column of other gray-faced ghosts, men who had been stripped of everything but the animal instinct to put one foot in front of the other. The Soviet soldiers herded them with an air of weary indifference. They were not cruel, nor were they kind. They were simply victors, and the men of the Sixth Army were simply the spoils of a long and brutal siege. The weeks that followed were a blur of marching, of crowded cattle cars, of transit camps that were little more than barbed wire enclosures in the middle of the endless snow. Men died on the march. They died in the cars from typhus and frostbite. They died in the camps from a quiet, creeping despair. Klaus moved through it all in a state of profound detachment. The part of him that felt, that remembered, had been buried in the cellar with Lucas. All that remained was a body, an automaton that knew how to breathe, to walk, to obey. One day, they were herded into a new camp. This one was more permanent, with long wooden barracks and a proper cookhouse from which a thin plume of smoke trailed into the sky. They were processed, their names and ranks recorded by a tired-looking Soviet officer. Then they were given their first meal in the camp. They lined up with their mess tins. The same tins that had held gray sausage and sawdust bread and potato stew. A guard, a stout, middle-aged man with a face like a winter apple, was ladling out a thin, reddish soup from a massive cauldron. Borscht. As Klaus reached the front of the line, the guard slopped a ladleful of the soup into his tin. Then he turned to a large sack beside him, pulled something out, and shoved it into Klaus's hand. It was a slice of bread. Klaus stared at it. It was not the light, airy bread of his father's bakery, nor the sawdust-filled brick of the front. It was dark, almost black, coarse and unevenly shaped. Russian black bread. He shuffled away from the line and found a place against the wall of the barracks, out of the wind. He held the bread in his hand. It was heavy, substantial. He could feel the dense, moist crumb through his thin gloves. He lifted it to his nose. It smelled earthy, sour, and faintly sweet. It smelled of rye, of molasses, of life. His hands were shaking. He looked around at the other prisoners, who were already hunched over their tins, wolfing down their soup and bread with a desperate, animal hunger. But Klaus waited. This was a ritual. This required reverence. He took a bite. The texture was rough, the crust chewy, the crumb dense and moist. And the flavor was an explosion. It was sour and deep and complex. It was everything the Ersatzbrot was not. It was honest. It was real. And with that taste, the wall inside him broke. The memory of his father's bakery came flooding back, not as a gentle dream, but as a violent, overwhelming torrent. The smell of the yeast, the feel of the warm dough, the roar of the oven. He saw his father's flour-dusted hands. His own hands as a boy, learning to shape the loaves. He tasted the potatoes he'd shared with Lucas, the one moment of warmth in a universe of cold. He saw the boy's pale, trusting face. He felt the weight of the uneaten biscuit in his pocket, a sacrament of his failure. He tasted the grit and despair of the last few months, the chemical tang of fake sausage, the bitterness of acorn coffee. It all came at once. Grief, and relief, and shame, and a profound, aching sorrow. He was eating the bread of his enemy, and it was the first real thing he had tasted in a year. Tears froze on his cheeks. He did not sob. He just sat there, against the rough wood of the barracks wall, in a Soviet prisoner-of-war camp 1,000 miles from home, and slowly, deliberately, ate his slice of bread. Each bite was survival. Each bite was a memory. Each bite was a gravestone for the boy he had failed and the man he used to be. The war was over for him. But the taste, he knew, would remain forever.